Well, in 1994, a 67-year-old carpenter by the name of Russell Herman, he died, and in his will, he included this amazing amount of money that he was leaving to these different people and organizations. He left $2 million to East St. Louis. He left $1.5 billion to the state of Illinois. He left $2.5 billion to the National Forest System. He left a lot of others. And then he left $6 trillion to help with the national debt. Now, if you know anything about money, no one has that amount of money. Bill Gates, one of the richest people alive, his income is about $90 billion, his worth. And so there was the man who dies, and in his will, he leaves these things that he didn't have. He wanted to be generous. He liked the idea of being generous. And so he left money that wasn't his. It was the idea of being generous without having to actually be generous. What's really interesting, if you read these stories, there's now lawsuits and trying to figure out how these people are going to get some of this money. I mean, just this long list of generosity that was left by this man that didn't exist. Now, here's, as we wrap up this series, I want us to be a people who live generously and not just talk about being generous. Okay, and so in this series, we've talked about money and that money matters. Money matters because Jesus talks about it often, and so we think that it's something that we need to talk about. It matters how you save it and how you spend it, how you make it, how you give it. Money matters, and it matters because it affects your heart and it affects my heart. And so we've wanted to give some attention to this and pay attention to what it does to our hearts, because we do want to lead the way with radical generosity. We say that often. We want to lead the way in radical generosity where our local community, the people around here, benefit because we're generous people. And our global community, as we talked about Josue, that he benefits in El Salvador because we are generous people. And I care about you, and I care about what money does to your heart and to my heart, and so that's why we're wrestling with this. And so we're going to wrap this series up today. Next week, we're going to start a series on the book of Ruth, the story of redemption in kind of an unfamiliar, unexpected way. And so if you want to read ahead in the Old Testament, we're going to talk about the Bible, the story of Ruth. But first off, before we finish this, let me say this one last time. This is not a message about guilt. This is not a message about shame. It is a message about grace and what I believe God wants for you and for me. It's not about getting you to give more money to Trinity. I know some churches that do a message on money, and then at the end, there'll be a commitment card where you're going to commit to giving so much money over the next year. We're not doing that. No one's going to follow up. I think if you give to Trinity, God has put that on your heart and will continue to do that. But I've encouraged you just to be generous. If you don't want to give to the church, if you're unsure of doing that, find somewhere else to give to. Find another organization, find something you believe in that you're passionate about, and give to them. And I know that money's been abused by a person, by an organization, by the church, and so there's some of this tension. And so I pray for one more week that you'll press into the tension, and that maybe you'll hear from God this morning. Maybe this is your first time with us in this series. Maybe you missed a week, and so let me just really quickly recap. The first week we talked about this guy named Solomon who wrote what we know as Ecclesiastes, one of the wealthiest, wisest people that we know. And he said this, one handful with tranquility or peace and rest is better than two handfuls with toil and a chasing after the wind. It's better to have a little and find peace and rest in your soul than to have a lot and to toil and have pain and suffering and a chasing after the wind, trying to get something we'll never get. And so we talked about that. How do we live life with one handful? And then the next week we talked about how dangerous it is to assume that everything we have is for ourselves, just for us to consume. That whatever we've been blessed with, whatever we worked hard for, it's for me. And we looked at this story leading into this guy who builds big barns to store all his extra stuff. And in the end of that story, Jesus says, look, the goal is that you'll be rich towards God. And being rich towards God really means being rich to his people, to be rich to one another. And then last week we talked about how Paul wrote a letter to Timothy, who was a young pastor who was leading a church, and said, command your people to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and share in all kinds of ways. And so we talked about how we have to be strategic in that, and we have to plan to be generous. And so this week I want to answer the question, kind of the why. Why is this so important? I talked about the heart, but why is it that God is after us being generous? Why is he a generous God, and why is it important that we follow after him? What is it that we really want to accomplish? Well, I read a blog this week from a non-Christian author that was talking about generosity, And he gave four reasons, four things that we should do to be generous, reasons why we should be generous. And the first one he said was that it frees us from materialism, which I agree with that. If you're able to give and to be generous, it kind of loosens the grip of money and stuff that we have. So I totally agree that we want to break the chain of materialism. He then says that we become less self-centered. And so I made the statement in this series that it's really we before me, that I have to care about my neighbor's needs and the worth of my neighbor as much as I do myself. And so this guy says that it makes us become less self-centered, which I agree with as well. He then says it makes you feel better about yourself, which I agree. When you're generous and you help someone out, there is this feeling of satisfaction that you have with yourself, but I'm not sure that's a reason to be generous. Again, that comes back to us and what we get from it. And then here's where we're headed today. The fourth reason he says that we should be generous is that it buys you future favors. That if you're generous and you help someone else out, then you might get something in return. That people you help will forever be appreciative and will more likely respond when you have a need of your own. It's this idea that I give to get something back. I'll serve you because I know that at some point I'm going to need something, and if I've helped you, then obviously you'll help me in return. And so this isn't that uncommon. We live kind of our lives like this. Who can I befriend? Who do I know that maybe there's going to be a benefit from that relationship? Who is it that has money and power? How can I get next to them? And just in case I need something, maybe they would help me out. My son is kind of obsessed with these guys called the Dude Perfect guys. There's these 5 guys, and they started this online page where they do trick shots, and they become extremely famous from it and make a ton of money off just doing these videos. And my son loves these guys. That's probably an understatement. And this last week, he was asking me about social media. He doesn't have social media, but he knows that I do. And he says, are you friends with the Dude Perfect guys on Facebook? And I was like, yeah. He goes, you're friends with them? And I was like, well, that term is kind of loose. I was like, yeah, I follow him on Facebook, or I'm friends with him on Facebook, and I follow him on Instagram and Twitter. And he says, so is there a chance we could go down and meet them? And I was like, I don't think so. He goes, but you're friends with them. I was like, well, I'm not really friends, and so we probably can't go. And he said, well, could we possibly go to Texas and visit where they are and spend time with them? I was like, no, that's not how it's not how it works. Because I'm friends with them online doesn't mean I get a benefit from it. And then he says this, well, when I'm a dad, I'm going to take my kids to see Dude Perfect. And I was like, the pressure that comes from that, right? But there's this expectation for my son who's 6, like, if you've done something for someone or you call them friend, then there's going to be this return that you receive, right? So this author who writes this blog says, yeah, be generous because there's a chance that the favor will be returned to you. And so we give to get. Now, I'm going to read a scripture this morning, and then I'm going to pause, and we're going to look at kind of the context of culture when this was written, and then I'm going to come back to it. And so if you don't own a Bible, there should be a red Bible around you. I would encourage you to grab that. That's our gift to you. Please take that. So this is Luke 6:32. Luke was a physician. He was a doctor. So he's writing an account of Jesus' life and what Jesus had done. It's Luke 6, starting in verse 32. It says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. So here's the deal. When this was written, the first Christians, the early church, they didn't possess any power. They had very little power. They didn't have a building that they would regularly meet in. They didn't have a church building. They met in people's homes. So they didn't have power. They didn't have a building. They were never organized by the government, so they didn't have a 501c3 that they went underneath. They were just a group of people who were passionately following Jesus. And actually, they were utterly and completely powerless. They were powerless in the sense of culture. And so socially, they weren't really accepted. They were often seen as outcasts. They were persecuted politically, and so whoever was ruling in that day did not like what the Christians were doing. He thought they were after power, and so they would persecute these guys. Sometimes they were eventually tortured physically. I don't know if you know this, but most of the disciples that we read about in the Bible died a lot like Jesus did. They were put to death because of the faith that they had. But this didn't stop the movement of the early church. That the church actually early in the days were growing astronomically. And it wasn't by power, it wasn't by wealth. They were known not by their theology. It wasn't necessarily what they believed, because their theology was really odd for most of the people. Even the religious people didn't always understand what they were trying to say. But there was something that gave them leverage in their communities and in their cities, and it was really their love for people. That's what it was. It was their compassion for their enemies. It was compassion in the way they would serve those who weren't like them. That is what was causing the church to grow tremendously, by being generous to those who had a need. They didn't have much in the way of money, but what they did have, they tried to give away. They tried to help. They didn't receive compassion from people, but they were quick to give compassion away. They were impossible to ignore. Their impact was monumental. Now, why is this such a big deal? The reason is that during this time, there was this idea that you gave in order to receive, just like we kind of were talking about. This was very prevalent in the early centuries. You gave because you needed something in return. People would only give to someone if there was even a chance they could help them out. Why serve? Why assist? Why do anything if there wasn't a chance that they would do it back to you? There was this Latin term, I'm going to try to say this with my Oklahoma draw, all right? Liberalitas. If you speak Latin, you could probably say that a little better than me. But it literally means give to get, right? Give to get. And it was actually printed on their money. It was printed on their money that I give in order to hopefully get something in return. And so the Roman emperor would come into a town, into a village, and they would parade into the village, and they would throw this money out. They would give the money away with this term on it, give to get, and the hope that someone eventually, if they needed something, would support the emperor. They were buying people's support. So in that economy, you gave to get. Again, no reason to serve, no reason to help, no reason to do anything if that person had no way of returning the favor. Why waste good deeds on someone if you weren't going to get something back? You would want to find someone who was better off than you. So who could I go help knowing that they would do something good for me? Now, we see this even today. I was thinking about with the Super Bowl today, so professional athletes, musicians, actors, some of the richest people in our world are given the most free stuff. They're given stuff. And the reason they're given stuff, whether it's shoes or clothes or food, they're given this because the hope is that those people will do something in return for their company. So the wealthiest continue to get things because there is a thought that they'll do something in return. So we see that. And that's how it was during that time. But then Jesus comes. And Jesus begins to help people he knows will never be able to help him. He extends grace to people that would never be able to return that favor. This is the life that Jesus begins to live. Jesus had a half-brother named James who did not really believe that Jesus was who he said he was until Jesus dies and he has the resurrection. And so James then begins to write parts of the Bible. And James 1:27, James basically kind of summarizes, in my mindset, he kind of summarizes what he saw in Jesus and what Jesus stood for. James 1:27, it says this: religion, a set of beliefs. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. James, in a summary, in my mind, this is a summary that James is giving. If you want to know what honors God, if you want to think about religion and what you believe, if you want to know what's pure and faultless, it's this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep yourself from being polluted by the world. Now, this is what I know that many of us believe if you're a follower of Jesus. We often think keeping from being polluted by the world means I don't do bad things. Right? There's bad things that are going on around me. People make really bad decisions. There's evil around me. And so I'm not going to participate in those things. And by not participating in those things, I'm not being polluted by the world. And the theological, the big word for that are sins of commission. So these are sins that I commit. But there's also this idea of sins of omission, right? These are things that I'm supposed to do that I don't do. Forgive people, love my enemy, right? And so this idea of not being polluted by the world, I don't think it's just about what we don't do. I think it's very easy for us to become polluted by some ideas in our world that keeps us from living out the ways of Jesus. And so when James says the orphans and the widows, what he's saying is there's a group of people who are utterly powerless and penniless, that people are always overlooking, the widows and the orphans. They had no land. Women in that day weren't seen necessarily to carry power that was based on their husband, and now they don't have their husband. An orphan has no one. And so James is saying, look, if you want to know what God is really after, it's caring for those people. It's caring and helping those who can never return the favor. It's really not that different in our world today. The people who are often the most helpless, can give us nothing in return, are often the people who are the most overlooked. Why waste our resources? Why waste our time, our energy, our good deeds on someone who could never return the favor? We hear Jesus say that there's a life that is much different. So in Luke 6:32, what good is it to love those who love you? Even those who don't claim to follow Jesus, they'll do that. I mean, doing good for those who do good to you, well, even those who don't follow Jesus, they're going to do that. To lend to someone, to help someone, to assist someone with no expectation of getting anything back. That's a different way of living life, and this is what Jesus is after. See, this is where it gets difficult. Is Jesus comes to establish a different kind of kingdom. See, many people thought Jesus was going to come to give this power to a kingdom. He's going to overrule what was going on in that day, but Jesus doesn't do that. He comes and lives a life much different. And so, please hear me. In our culture today, living in America, it's very easy for us to become Americans before we're Christians. Right? And that could be said in a lot of ways. Like, it could be easy for me to be a male before I'm a Christian, or to be a husband before I'm a Christian, or a pastor before I'm a Christian. And so Jesus comes to establish a very different kind of kingdom, a Jesus kind of kingdom, a kingdom of heaven, not an earthly kingdom. And so there's this temptation often. There's this temptation often that we put our love for America before our love for God. And look, I'm so thankful to be born here. I didn't choose that. I'm thankful and feel blessed that I was born where I was born. I don't take my freedoms lightly. My dad was a Marine and served in the Vietnam War. He was shot. I've heard stories. I've seen the pain that it's caused my dad, the problems that have come from that. Like, I don't take that lightly. I'm so thankful for our armed services who go and protect and fight for not our own country, but other countries for freedom. Like, I'm blessed and I am thankful. But look, I follow Jesus first. I follow the teaching of Jesus before I do anything else. I submit to his leadership and authority before I submit to anything else. And I think it's important that we understand that the kingdom that Jesus brings is much different. And so when we think of generosity and we think of why it matters because we're a part of a different kind of kingdom. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're a part of a different kind of kingdom. And so his ways are tough. Jesus' teaching is tough. We talked about this. There were people who would hear his teaching and they would walk away. But then there were people who pressed into it. The early church pressed into it and they bought it. They believed it and they lived it out. And it was this idea that things were going to function differently. One of my favorite stories that I read in the Bible is where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And many of you know this story, and it can be very easy just to kind of think you've heard it, so what does it really matter? But if you haven't heard it, there's this moment before Jesus goes to a cross. It's really just hours before he's arrested and begins the trial and movement towards the cross. He's with his followers. They've had a meal. And they're spending time with one another. And Jesus gets up from the table, and he grabs a towel, and he grabs a bowl of water, and he begins to wash his disciples' feet. Now, before this is what Jesus says. Jesus says he's given all power and authority, that he can do whatever he wants, that he's the one in control, that no one is greater than him. And so what he could have done there in that moment is to tell everyone what they should do for him, how they should serve him and honor him. But this is what he does. He grabs a bowl, and he grabs a towel, and he begins to wash his disciples' feet. Now, in this day, they would obviously walk in sandals and walk dirt roads, and so their feet were disgusting, you can imagine. And so usually when you walked into someone's home, there'd be a bowl of water and a towel, and you would wash your own feet. Sometimes a servant, the lowest of lows that you would have to do as a servant is to wash guests' feet. No one would ever want to do that. And most people who had any type of servant wouldn't even want to make their servants do that. And Jesus on his own chooses to do this. He says, look, I want you to have all the power and authority, and I'm not going to abuse it. I'm actually going to use it to serve you, to paint a picture of what life looks like in the kingdom. And so at the end of this, after he washes his disciples' feet, he says, now you go and do likewise. Now you go and you use your power and your influence and your opportunities not to be served, but to serve. And then moments after that, Jesus goes and he lays his life down for his followers. He gives himself up completely for you and for me. And so this is what the early church did. They took this teaching literally. They took the commands of Jesus personally and said, all right, well, this is how we're going to live our lives. This is all they could do. They had no other option. They had no other option but to be generous and to live out a life of love and compassion for all people. Generosity was all that they had. What's really interesting, if you know history, in the early centuries in the ancient world, there were these plagues that were coming through. And these plagues would come through, and the people who were not sick were fleeing the cities. They didn't want to get sick, and so they would leave. And so these pagan priests, these people who led people who were not followers of Jesus, who were not religious, they would flee first. They had a lot to lose. They had a great amount of wealth, and so they would leave. And then people would begin to flee, and the only people, this is history, not even just something you read in the Bible, history, Christians were the ones who stayed. Christians were the ones that stayed and began to take care of people who were sick, actually putting themselves in harm's way, knowing that they could lose their lives by taking care of someone else. Not even someone they knew, not someone who was family, not someone who believed like they did or looked like they did, but someone who was in need. It was an opportunity for them to live out the idea of giving to someone who could possibly never give anything in return. There's also stories that the people would throw their loved ones in the street. Before they had died, if they were really sick and had this plague, they would actually put them in the street so that they wouldn't get sick. And then the Christians would go and gather these people up. They would gather these people and they would take care of them. And many of them would come to health. And they would live. And then this documented, many of these people would begin to follow Jesus. Not because of theology. Not because of the belief system of these people who were Jesus followers, but the way their theology worked itself out in their life. Right? It was what these disciples believed that they were putting into practice. And the people they helped thought, man, I want some of that. I want to know more about Jesus because of the way you are living out your faith. There was an emperor named Julian who was against Christianity. It begins to grow, and he's trying to stop it from growing. And in some of his letters, this is what he wrote. He said, they, meaning followers of Jesus, they support not only their own poor, but ours as well. This is someone who is not a Jesus follower. This is someone who wanted to stop Christianity from spreading, but he recognized, look, those people don't just help their own, but they help our people as well. It's not hard to see that the church grew this way. By their generosity, people began to follow Jesus. See, the early followers of Jesus took the commands of Jesus literally, as I said. They took them literally. They had seen and experienced the love of Jesus, and so they lived them out in their daily lives. 1 John 2 says this, starting in verse 1. My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin, but if anybody does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. He's the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for our sins, but also for the sins of the whole world. So John, who's writing this, is saying, look, our goal is to not sin. Our goal is obedience, to follow Jesus. But when you do sin, we have Jesus who speaks on our behalf. That he paid the price so that we could experience grace and forgiveness. And not just for us, but for the sins of the whole world. I don't know about you, but often when I read the Bible, I put my own setting and condition into what I read. And so as you think about the Bible and you think about what's written, and there's things like to the ends of the earth, I don't know if you know this, but that's us. I don't know if you know that, but we are considered the ends of the earth. We're not the ones where necessarily the message begin to spread, right? So we are the ends of the earth. And so as we think about this, the sins of the whole world, that's us, way over here from where it started. And it's also for way over there where it continues to spread. The grace of God is for all people. The gift of this grace is for everyone, no matter where they come from, where they're born, or what they look like. And then he says this, verse 3. We know that we have come to know him if we obey his commands. The man who says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in him. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. If we say that we know him, but we don't do what he commands, we're a liar and the truth is not in him. But if anyone obeys the word, God's love is truly made complete in him. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. So what we say and how we live have to align. In what's known as the Sermon on the Mount, really one of the only teachings we have of Jesus where he kind of preaches, he calls his followers the salt and light, salt of the earth, the light of the world. And in that, he talks about how people will see our good deeds. You're the light of the world. People will see your good deeds and they will praise you. Right? That's not what it says. It doesn't say he'll praise you. What does it say? They will see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. And so the why is because we're called to be generous people. The why is because this is a radically different way of living life where we serve and help those who could never repay us. The why is we do these things because it honors God, and the hope is, what if there were people around who saw our good deeds and they begin to think, man, maybe there is a God. It breaks some assumptions about Christians. It breaks some assumptions about the church when people literally live out the teachings of Jesus, that they will give glory to him and not us. And so he talks about doing these good deeds and not looking for the attention. He continues on and says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. So we don't do these things so we look good. We don't do these things to brag about how great we are. We do what we do. We're generous people because it brings honor to God. Now let me just warn you, this is hard. This is hard. It's hard to give and give and give to people and not get anything in return. That's hard. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to get frustrated when you help people and you serve people and then you look at them and you think, man, they're doing nothing to help themselves. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to get tired. It's tiring to help people. It's tiring to serve people, but there's also this joy and this peace that comes when we live out this teaching of Jesus. And so we want to live this out. We don't want to just talk about it. And so in just about 2 minutes, I want to tell you a couple things that I would encourage you to think about, to pray about, as you think about loving people and helping the least of these, the widows and the orphans. Who are those people for us today? Well, one of those are refugees. And let me say this. Let's take the conversation of refugees out of should people come in or not, or where should they come in. Let's not talk about that. Okay? There's lots of passionate people on both sides. Let's talk about the people who are here, right? So maybe we think there should be different vetting, and maybe we think obviously we don't want the people who are trying to hurt us in, but so that's a conversation. But we have people here. You have neighbors. You have kids. There are kids that go to school with your kids who probably, you may not know it, but probably are refugees. And so what do we do to serve those in our communities who are here, who are seeking safety, who have a need? What do we do for those people? There's an organization called House of Goods. I just visited them last week. They get supplies in the hands of those who need it, who are getting a house for the first time, who have no financial help at the moment. They don't have a job yet. They get things into their hands. House of Goods. Maybe that's a place you want to look at. They need house linens, towels, sheets, comforters, pillows. Those are the kind of things that they need. We have a giving box in the back. You can drop that in there. I'll deliver it for you. We have someone who works down by there. We would love to get those things to them. There's an organization called Good Neighbor STL. They're trying to find Christian families who will partner with a refugee family, who will once a month will go in and have a meal, who will visit them and make sure they're doing okay. We already have several families here at Trinity who have already signed up for that. And there's a training. If you're interested in that, come and talk to me. There's an English class at some of the libraries called Fluency Friends. People learning to speak better English. You just go, you have a conversation with someone whose English is not their first language. Not only will it help you tremendously, I promise, but it's serving a need for the other person as well. How can you serve the refugee? Children, it's reading, it's mentoring, it's foster and adoption. Many of you are fostering, some of you have adopted. What if we continue that process? Maybe you're not at a point where you could foster or adopt. What would it look like to come alongside someone who is doing that? Maybe you can't do that right now, but what would it look like for you to pray for them, to ask them if there's anything that they need? What would that look like as we think about foster and adopting? Maybe it's coaching a city team. They need coaches all the time. What if maybe you don't have kids, but you want to help coach a team, or helping with the FIT program, our homeless kids in our own school district, or our senior citizens. It's home visits. It's the nursing home. Those are sometimes the most forgotten people. What would it look like to go in and to help and to spend time with someone? Ultimately, here's what I want you to do. Would you just ask God? Would you just begin to say, God, how would you have me serve? How would you have me be generous to the people around me? It doesn't have to be on this list. There's so many things that so many of you are doing that I know where you're loving people well. Where it's either in prisons or juvenile homes. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you guys are doing. What does it look like for you to take this teaching and say, all right, I'm going to do good, not just to those who do good to me. I'm going to love those who may never love me in return, those who will never be able to pay me back. What would that look like for you personally? And then as God begins to put something on your heart, you do it. You do it. And our hope is, and all of this as we think about money, we begin to live in peace. The money doesn't control us. We experience that one handful with peace. That we understand what we've been given is an opportunity to bless others, to help others, to come alongside others. That we're strategic about it, that we plan how we're going to be generous, and ultimately, our goal is to bring honor to God. That people will see your good deeds and my good deeds and begin to praise your Father in heaven. Would you pray with me? God, thanks for today. Thanks for this last 5 weeks, God, just how you've been teaching me and challenging me as I think about my own thoughts about money. God, would you help us as a group of people to first acknowledge you, to come under your kingdom, to live out your teaching, to support what you've called us to do, to be generous people, to live in a different kind of kingdom. Would you help us to do that? Would you put something on our hearts? As my friends, I pray take it seriously to ask you what you would want them to do. Would you put something on our hearts, and then would you help us to be bold enough to follow through, to have the courage to love those who may never return the favor? God, we love you. Thank you for what you've called us to here in North County. Would you continue to help us lead the way with radical generosity? I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Love you guys. See you next week.